Tick, 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 tick. There we go. Okay, but of course it's not on the correct settings. I have to click one more thing than I should, but whatever. All right, now it is working, well, as correctly as we can hope. Technology being a funny thing, who knows how correct it will work throughout the discussion. All right, well, we are at only 1 minute, 30 seconds. That's not a bad startup time. We are in the midst of the story of the Exodus, and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, is one of the most profound narratives found throughout the Torah. Obviously, there was so much to discuss. We did a little bit last week, but this week I want to talk about a particular ethical quandary that often comes up in discussions regarding the Exodus. Or rather, I should say it comes up a lot in many discussions that are sometimes heated, dismissive, or offensive. However, it should come up in all of our discussions. It is a topic that should be discussed at every Seder, but one that perhaps people are afraid to discuss because they're unsure of the answer. Obviously, in Judaism, we do not hide from questions just because we're unsure of the answer. It's perfectly fine to say, I don't know, and to not be embarrassed by that. And the topic at hand is the slaying of the firstborn. So we're going to be looking at the section where Moses is outlining this coming plague, and we'll talk about what it means and who is affected by it, which is sort of the main ethical quandary at hand. And we'll see what our tradition has said about this very intense passage. So with that, we are in chapter 11 of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. I'm picking up on verse 4. And the story so far, I'm sure many of us are familiar with. All of the other plagues have come and gone. Pharaoh has vacillated between acquiescing to our demands and hardening and stiffening his resolve. And we are left still here, and God is now instructing that Moses will bring the final plague, the final strike against Egypt that will not only secure our release, but will actually secure us being thrown out of the country, if you will, driven out of the country. We will not slink away, we will march away at their request rather than because we just left one day. That's a whole nother discussion. So let's get down to the description of the plague. Moshe said, "Thus said Adonai, in the middle of the night I will go forth throughout the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn shall die throughout the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the maid who is behind the handmill, and every firstborn of the beast." All right, so we've got a number of questions that we need to wrestle with in verse 5 here. The idea that we're leaving, sure, fine, everybody's on board with that, into slavery, yay. That it's going to come as a result of this plague, striking the firstborn of Egypt, well, that can be problematic for us, because after all, it is not the firstborn of Egypt that are responsible, are they? Isn't it Pharaoh that is responsible? Is there any culpability, any responsibility for our enslavement on their shoulders, that they are being punished for us to be freed? Couldn't we have come up with a different solution other than this? Additionally, we have the question of, well, even if we can entertain that Pharaoh's own family would be affected as a right or proper effect of the enslavement, and perhaps as well as a proper recompense to the killing of the Israelite children when the boys were thrown into the Nile. Well, what about the firstborn of a servant, of a slave? She's there tilling at the handmill, which is considered one of the lowest jobs in the society. Why would I expect her child to be hurt? And to add even more to that, why would an animal be slain as part of this? Now, there is a very simple, superficial and oft use critique of this action. And I will present it simply so that we can hear a different voice from outside of our tradition. And that is because this is what you do when you want to hurt your enemy. That this is a vengeful act, that this is indeed disproportionate if you want to try and come up with a proportional allocation, that this is group punishment, that this is entirely unethical, because it was chosen to kill the firstborn because they were the treasured possessions in many of the ancient world cultures as well. But most importantly, because it was hurting even the possessions of the possessions, meaning that the servants, the slaves, well, that's also property of the nation. And the animals are property of the nation. By killing both the servants' offspring as well as their animal offspring, by treating them as similar to each other, essentially, this is not only a population attack, this is an economic attack against all of Egypt. And that is the brutal nature of the strife. And we shouldn't expect there to be anything ethical about this. This is purely vengeance, and thus beyond moral calculus in its normal form. Now, I disagree with that analysis. While I do think that there is certainly a notion of punishment that is meant to be entertained in the 10th plague, just like all of the other plagues, I don't think that this is vengeance off the leash. I don't think that this is a reckless or a supererogatory level of attack. And I don't think that this is meant to reflect a treatment of the slaves or the animals as being merely property. Now, I'm not alone in that. Our tradition has asked this question as well. We're going to continue out through the rest of this section, and then we're going to come back to this in much more detail with our commentaries from the last 2,000 years. So once all of this takes place, verse 6 tells us, "Then shall there be a cry throughout all the land of Egypt, the like of which has never been, the like of which will never be again." And this cry, of course, is an echo of the cry that the Israelites let out that we heard back in, I think it was chapter 3, when God is hearing the cry of the Israelites and appointing Moses as the one to come and effect the redemption. "But against all the children of Israel, no dog shall wag its tongue against either man or beast, in order that you may know that Adonai makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." So despite all of this calamity, not even a dog will bark as we are leaving. So this will be a exceedingly supernatural occurrence, which will be characterized by something as odd as this, as the dogs being able to tell the difference between one and the other. And that will let you know that indeed this is not just a random occurrence. "Then all these your servants shall go down to me, they shall bow to me, saying, Go out, you and all the people who walk in your footsteps, and afterwards I will go out. He went out from Pharaoh in flaming anger." So this is Moses saying that you, meaning Pharaoh, you and everybody else are going to capitulate. You are going to bow to me, meaning beg for mercy, and you will send us out. You have been reluctant to this point. You have vacillated to this point. Once the 10th plague has happened, you will be adamant that we leave. And then we see that Moses does indeed have a temper. We have seen him be extremely calm throughout this entire cycle of the plagues, which, according to a close reading of the text, was over the course of a year. But we do know from later incidents that Moses does have a temper on him. He controls it almost all the time, but here we see it flare up. And in Fox's translation, the flaming anger, of course, is trying to capture that unique idiom of the fiery nose of Hebrew. But recognize that Moses is perhaps angry because it has come to this, that he had hoped that this final plague could have been avoided, yet here they are. Adonai said to Moshe, "Pharaoh will not hearken to you," meaning to the warning, "in order that my portents may be many in the land of Egypt." And Moses and Aaron had done all the portents in Pharaoh's presence, but Adonai had made Pharaoh's heart strong-willed, and he had not sent the children of Israel free from his land. And again, we've talked in previous classes about the hardening, the strengthening, the stiffening of resolve of Pharaoh, or as he puts it here, making him strong-willed. This was not forcing Pharaoh to do something against his own will. This was making sure that Pharaoh could still exercise his will, even though it was for ill for himself and for the Israelites. Okay, before we jump into the commentary that's going to focus on the verse 5, are there any other questions from the text that we have now read? Double check our YouTube chats. Okay, so as I said, there are a number of layers to this question. The first is, why is there a slaying of the firstborn at all? And as I mentioned, that already seems to be at least proportionally understood as being a response to the murder of the boys of Israel that were thrown into the Nile, which Moses fulfilled the letter of the law, but escaped, obviously, the death. But it is the secondary levels of it, I think, that has caused the most head-scratching and consternation. Why would it signal out even the lowest of the Egyptian society? Why the animals as well? So with those questions in mind, let's go ahead and see what our commentators have said and see what we can feel. As always, there will be multiple opinions because there are usually multiple ways to address these types of questions. Why were the captives smitten? For they had not enslaved the Israelites. So this is referring to the later passage where we see the outcome of the plague, where the servant at the handmill is replaced by the prisoner in the jail, and as such, we are wondering why, in that case, it says that the prisoners are also. What role could they have had in enslaving the Israelites? They were not in charge of this. I mean, they were captives as well. But this was in order that they might not say that their God had claimed satisfaction for the humiliation imposed upon them and had brought this punishment upon the Egyptians. So essentially drawing from the idea that we saw in the following verses that God would make a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians, the Midrash, which Rashi is paraphrasing here, is arguing that had the prisoners also been spared the plague, then they would have taken credit for not having been hurt. They would have said that their God, some idol that they worshiped, had been the one to defend them because Egypt had put them in chains. So in order to ensure that that could not be argued, in order to ensure that everyone would understand this was just Adonai acting only in favor of the Israelites, they had to be affected by the plague as well. Now, we're going to be coming across this concept a few times as we go, so let's go ahead and just get it percolating in the back of our head. Don't expect yourself to come to a smooth resolution yet, but is it appropriate? Is it fitting? Is it right to cause a punishment, especially one as severe as this, to accrue to a group of people merely to rule out an error that they might claim? That is to say, if they had actually not deserved the punishment, but they instead got the punishment to prevent a misunderstanding of the scenario, is that really just? Is that really fair that they get punished for something that they had not yet done and might do, which in and of itself also would not be a horrific crime? Well, no worse than just having idols to worship in the first place. Again, we're not going to answer that question right now. We may not feel like we have a satisfactory answer to that by the time we're done. Certainly other commentaries do not feel this is the only explanation, or else we'd be done after 15 minutes. So that always tells you that there is a certain amount of disquiet with some commentaries if there are multiple competing views. So let's take a look at Rashi's explanation as well of why we have our bookends of from the top and bottom social rung. all who were of less importance than the firstborn of Pharaoh and of more importance than the firstborn of the handmaid are included in this description. And why were the sons of the handmaidens stricken? Because they too treated the Israelites as slaves and rejoiced at their misery. All right, so Rashi begins to show that even for himself, he is not 100% satisfied with his prior interpretation, that it was just to prevent them from claiming credit, but is also including a reference to the Midrash, which we'll see in its detail in a moment, that says that the servants that were within Egypt also lorded it over the Israelites, that the Israelites were at the very bottom rung, and that other servants, who may also have been slaves, treated the Israelites with disdain and mocked them and rejoiced in their servitude because, well, it made those of a higher level, but still at the bottom of Egyptian society, feel better about themselves. We have seen this play out in multiple countries. I don't think this is too far-fetched to imagine. I've seen it with my own eyes, that people who are often at the end of the social hierarchy will rejoice when they find somebody below them that they can then step on to give themselves a feeling of elevation. It's a sad tendency in human cultures, but it is one that certainly does play out. As we see in the longer midrash here from the Mechilta, and we are hereby apprised that the captives rejoiced in all the decrees inflicted by Pharaoh upon Egypt, for which they were punished. And this is in keeping with the saying in Proverbs 17, he who rejoices in another's misfortune will not be absolved, as well as in Psalms 24, do not rejoice in the downfall of your foe. And in Ezekiel 26, Son of man, because Tyre has said about the besieged Jerusalem, Heach, expression of joy, kind of like huzzah, thus said the Lord God, behold, Tyre, I am coming against you, and I will raise up many nations against you, as the sea raises its waves. And not only the captives alone were thus smitten, but even the men servants and maid servants, as we see in Exodus 17, when we actually get the exposure to the plague, until the firstborn of the maidservant. All right, so as is usual, Rashi paraphrased the Midrash. Here, the Midrash brings many more citations and explanation, and a little bit more depth. That indeed, Judaism teaches that that Schadenfreude, that celebration of someone else's misery, is a terrible behavior. And in fact, it is a terrible behavior that is worthy in its own way of being punished. Now, again, we can allow that one part of our brain to continue to process. Is it worthy of this punishment? Is laughing at somebody falling over as bad as pushing someone over? But hold that in the back of your mind. But let's just recognize the basic teaching here, which is that just because you are not the primary actor in the persecution or harm caused to another person does not mean that you are off the hook if you also take pleasure, if you rejoice, if you are celebrating that other person's suffering. This is a very powerful concept because, like we said earlier, it is natural for people to rejoice at the suffering of someone else. It is even more natural to rejoice at the suffering of someone that you might have felt justified against. And while that's not the case with the captives or maidservants towards the Israelites, it certainly would be the case for the Israelites towards the Egyptians. And indeed, there is a strong narrative within Jewish tradition that one should not rejoice at the slaughter that took place at this time. We can rejoice at our liberation, we can celebrate our redemption, but that we need to recognize that the price that was paid by the Egyptians and the others in their nation is not something that we should celebrate in and of itself. It may have been a necessary component to our liberation, but it was not a component that by itself we should be happy that it occurred. So in addition to the Midrash explaining why the prisoners and maidservants were also afflicted by the plague, we should also recognize that, as is often the case, Midrashim are often aimed at the reader to explain how they should behave. That this Midrash was brought not just so that we could understand why they were also inflicted, but that we should learn from it not to behave likewise. This is the classic form of so many midrashim, where it may appear that it's explaining an event in the past, but what it is actually doing is giving you instruction for the present. That as a reader of this midrash, we should walk away from this not only understanding what happened in Egypt, but being better strengthened to avoid these types of mistakes, of laughing at someone else's misfortune in our own life, our own day. And if we don't learn that, well, then I'm afraid the rabbis have they are very disappointed in us. Okay, so that's one way to understand this whole idea, is that the captives, the maidservants, they were all afflicted because they had been a source of affliction. Maybe not the primary, but certainly they had bought into the system. So we continue now with Chizkuni, who provides a slightly different narrative on this topic. When Moses said every firstborn will die, the firstborn of the maidservants rejoiced, noting that they are not considered in the eyes of the Jewish God from the firstborn of the nobility. So Chizkuni is trying to explain that they ended up in a particular way. As I mentioned before, our text in this chapter describes it from being the maidservants, and then in the later chapter, it describes the prisoners in jail. What Chizkuni is trying to do here is read how we went from being a millstone grinder to being a prisoner, and incorporating that in a narrative, that they are not just synonymous, but that in fact there is a sub-story going on here. Chizkuni is also reading it in the eyes of some of the midrashim, which says that when it says from Pharaoh's from the Pharaoh's son on the throne to the maidservant at the millstone, that was not an inclusive bookend, that it meant it went down but would stop before the maidservants, meaning that indeed the slaves were not affected by this. However, when their masters noted their joy, meaning when the slaves, the Egyptian slaves, were like, "Whew, at least we're not going to be affected by this one," their masters recognized that they were happy that they were spared, which meant that they were happy that the masters were the ones who were suffering. They threw them, the maidservants, in a dungeon to teach them a lesson and not forget their place in the Egyptian hierarchy. So again, Chizkuni is essentially channeling that same notion of do not rejoice at the suffering of others, that even within Egyptian society that was considered in bad taste, and certainly it was considered not very sensible, because they were still slaves and they could still be punished by their Egyptians, and indeed they were thrown into the jail. As a result, they died while still in the dungeon. So when we get to that later verse that says it was through the people in prison, these are the same people who were not going to be affected originally, but ended up being there in the end. In effect, what happened is simply that the firstborn, who had been only slaves at the time of the plague, had become also prisoners by the time the plague became effective. So harmonizing the two different texts, as well as providing a moral linkage for how they ended up where they were. Now note, Chizkuni is providing an alternative, or at least additional explanation for why the maidservants would also be caught up in the punishment. That they not only mocked those Israelites that were beneath them in the hierarchy of Egypt, but they were also callous to the suffering of their own compatriots, that their fellow Egyptians of higher status were going to be suffering this horrific loss, and they very callously expressed their happiness that they were being spared this. Now, that may be natural, but it is exceedingly heartless to outwardly express your joy to people that are going to be facing great sorrow. So this adds to their crimes, if you will. And it may not be a crime against the Israelites, but it is a crime against their own fellows. And this is a recurring theme throughout much of the analysis of the Egyptian society, that as badly as they treated the Israelites, they also treated each other quite horribly. We'll see another example of that in just a minute. Any questions or comments before we carry on? Okay. So Tur HaAruch has another explanation for why the maidservant at the millstone is being caught up in this. When the Torah reports about the actual plague happening, it uses a different example when describing the woman at the lowest rung of the social order, namely the firstborn of the prisoner in jail, as we've talked about. Actually, the Torah refers to the same person each time. When the warning was issued, it was daylight, so that the prisoner was at work moving millstones. When the plague occurred, it was midnight, a time when all the prisoners are in their cells to prevent them from escaping. So as we see throughout the ancient world, including famously the story of Samson, prisoners were often used in slave-like labor, and then they would be returned to their official prisons until the next day when they would be brought out and forced to do more labor. So Tur HaAruch is perhaps removing some of the explanation of why these prisoners would be punished and putting us back in the position of perhaps moral quandary. That no, they're just being moved around in different times. It's not because they were mocking the others or otherwise. It was just that was normal within their society, and he doesn't feel that their death is necessarily then out of place. Okay, like I said, I want to make sure that we continue to have a little disquiet as we discuss this, because clearly our ancestors have had questions about this, or else we wouldn't have these commentaries. I should point out, as always, this is merely scratching the surface of the depth of discussion for this topic within our tradition. So before we get back into more information about the actual plague, I also wanted to touch on one other topic, which was the fact that the firstborn of beasts are going to be killed. Now, as I said at the outset, one could simply hand wave this as being, well, that's just economic punishment. There's no reason why they shouldn't do that. But our tradition is not happy with that. Famously, at the end of the book of Jonah, God says, when trying to explain to Jonah why he's not wiping out the city of Nineveh, that there are animals in that city, in addition to the human beings that don't know their left and right. There are animals in that city that are perfectly innocent, and if it's avoidable, God would not want them to suffer. God may not be a strict vegetarian by any stretch of the imagination, as the ancient sacrificial service demonstrates, but God does believe that there should not be unnecessary suffering among animals. We have a whole mitzvah that is built around that, and many of our halachot are designed to prevent that. So we need more of an explanation than just, that's the way you hurt the Egyptians. And what does Rashi tell us? Because they, the Egyptians, worshipped the animals, as gods. When the Holy One, blessed be he, exacts punishment from a nation, he punishes their gods at the same time, as we see in Genesis Rabbah 96:5. Now, why would that be the case? Well, on the surface, it's simply a very thorough way of tearing down the edifice of authority within a nation. The nation is acting high and mighty. They are believing themselves justified in their oppression by hurting not only the oppressors, but also the symbols of their oppression, in this case, their pantheon. You are tearing down more than just the people wielding power. You are tearing down the structure of power in its entirety. So that makes a great deal of sense. There is a second reason as well, which is that when a nation goes through a calamity, there is an alternative explanation for how to understand the calamity. And indeed, this is the typical Jewish explanation, which is to say, when the first temple was destroyed, we didn't say it was because the Babylonian gods were stronger than our God. We said it was because our God was allowing us to be punished because of our crimes. So in this way, had their symbols of their gods remained intact, the Egyptians might have thought not that Adonai was supreme in the world, but that their gods were punishing them for one reason or another, and that was where they should focus their attention and faith. So by wiping out representatives of the different pantheon of Egypt, which was heavily animalistic, they were able to make sure that Egypt would not say that it was from their gods, for their gods would never destroy their own representation. So it's an interesting way to try and solve this problem. Okay, let's move on then to Or HaChaim as we come back to this question of the slaying of firstborn, and again a very tight reading of the original text. Every firstborn will die. God did not say, I will kill him. Now, that is a very true sentence, right? The grammar of the original is every firstborn will die, rather than I will kill every firstborn. The reason, as we have pointed out on previous occasions, is that evil does not originate with God. So this is a classic position of Or HaChaim and many others of his school of thought, that what we call evil, that is to say, the actual harm that is done through evil, is not located in its genesis within God. Rather, God is the creator of all that is good. Anything in the nature of evil is initiated by one of the agents he has designated. So God has set up a system where things that we perceive as bad, such as the bad killing of the firstborn, because that is something that will cause great lament and suffering, but God himself does not carry that out. God has instead created a system where it will be carried out, to switch back to the passive voice, which English and Hebrew both use in similar fashion. So in this way, God has arranged it that he himself is not the executioner. God himself indicated who was the firstborn. His agents carried out the death sentence. This is why the mention of destroyers at the time of the Israelites put the blood on their doorposts, and the fact that God himself orchestrated the plague are not contradictory. So you might think, but wait, God said that he was involved, but then it says that there were the destroyer passing through. That seems mutually contradictory, but Or HaChaim says, no, it is not. God set the system in motion, much like a judge. However, the actual execution came at the hand of the executioner, which was not the same as the judge. So we can ask, is that fundamentally different? To have God be the source of the system that will allow the punishment to occur, is that really different than being more hands-on, than getting involved directly in the execution? Is it not fundamentally the same thing? After all, if I were to hire somebody to kill an enemy of mine, I think most of us would be willing to say that the conspiracy to kill originated with the person that did the hiring. Even if we might still differentiate between the person who arranged for the murder from the person who executed the murder, we would still want to lay much of the responsibility, even the lion's share, at the foot of the person who orchestrated it. However, what Or HaChaim is trying to argue here is that the essence of what is wrong comes as a result of other systems within God's world, not because God is choosing to make bad happen to this person. That God has created a system where bad is possible in response to the actions and the nature of the universe, and that is not God's desire. It is not God's interjection into the world. If anything, God has given us and the world a structure that allows us to avoid evil in many, many different ways. Most easily simply by choosing not to engage in evil, but even through the more random happenstance of disease and other disaster, by giving us the sechel, the mind to analyze the world and find ways to prevent and treat such problems. So it is not that God is sending the evil. It is that God has created a system where such bad events can take place in response to the nature of the universe itself. And that is an important theological distinction. Because would we think of God as being an entity that is actually adding evil to the world as a direct action, it would fundamentally, well, blur the lines between good and evil. And Or HaChaim and many other theologians do not want to wrap God up in that, and find it much more appropriate and much more accurate to describe the division between good and evil as being good flowing from God and evil flowing from the absence of God, which invites the interaction of the forces that God has created in the world to deal with those situations. All right, that may have gotten a little philosophical, but I hope that there was at least some value for those listening. All right. As we continue on here through the Mechilta back into our discussion of the firstborn, we see that when it actually happens and they are lamenting and crying out, they express the phrase, for they said, we are all dying. Now, they said, it is not as Moses said, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die. What does this mean? Why would they find this contradictory? Well, they had thought that if one had 4 or 5 sons, only the firstborn among them would die. So the basic principle was firstborn means the firstborn of the father with the mother. That is the person that's going to be slated. But more are dying than just that firstborn. And so they are saying, we're all dying. Wait, more people are dying than we're supposed to. Moses only said the firstborn, yet here there are more that are dying. What's going on? This is not what we were warned about. However, the reason that this is happening, well, says the Mechilta, not realizing that their wives were profligate and that they could have borne the firstborn of different men. So, according to our understanding of firstbornedness, or at least the most common explanation of firstbornedness, because there are a couple of variations, a firstborn is the firstborn of the father with a mother. So that would mean that if a woman had a husband and they had a child, that would be the firstborn of that husband. And if she were to have an affair with a different man who had not yet had a child, and she gave birth to that other man's child secretly, still within the house of her husband, and said it was his second child, well, that second child to the husband is actually the firstborn of her adulterous partner. As such, both would die from this plague, because both are technically firstborn, even if the husband didn't know that child number 2 was actually child number 1 of the adulterer, which would mean they, meaning the wives, wrought in secret. What they did in secret. Obviously, that's how adultery works. They hide. And the Holy One, blessed be he, exposed them. Now, does this not follow a fortiori, meaning all the more so? If in his lesser measure, that of punishment, one who acts in secret is exposed, how much more so will this hold for his greater measure, that of good? That is to say, secret acts of goodness will be blazoned forth. So in an attempt to explain that by doing mitzvot privately, that in the end it will be lauded publicly as a compliment, meaning that this will eventually shine out, that it is better to do things secretly in order that they will eventually have a large effect. We are learning it from the opposite, because after all, mercy and goodness is God's greater aspect, and punishment is what God only does when he has no choice. And if in punishment he will take the private and make it public, then certainly in the greater aspect, he will take what was private and make it public as well. Of course, this also is reflecting, as I mentioned earlier, a general attitude towards the many failings of Egyptian society. By saying that there were more deaths than expected, what is actually being said is that there were more illicit affairs than known. Because how else would other children be dying? Reminder that children can be full adults. How else would these other people be dying if not for the fact that they were actually the firstborn of someone, even though that was not known at the time, or at least not known by the husband of the family. Now, again, does this mean that we are just supposed to learn, oh, bad Egyptians, naughty, naughty? No, we are supposed to learn, one, to not behave like that, meaning don't have affairs, that you may think you'll be able to keep it secret. You may think you'll be able to prevent anyone from ever learning what you have done, but the truth will come out. It will be revealed. That which was done in private will eventually be exposed in order that punishment can take place. So rule number one, don't do these things and don't think you're getting away with it. But rule number two is, of course, what the last phrase is talking about, that what we do privately for good will be even more celebrated. That this is meant to be not only discouraging bad behavior, but it is meant to encourage good behavior and to not only worry, not worry that if, no one saw that I did good, well, then, when will I get credit for it? But that in fact, doing things privately for good will, in the long run, be a great blessing. Okay. One more dig at Egypt to help us again understand this overall structure, which also tries to naturalize the experience, recognizing that the Egyptians, from their point of view, what did they think was going on? All the firstborn came together with their fathers. They said to them, whatever Moses has said, he has brought upon us. Do you not wish us to live? Rather, come and let us have these go away from among us, for if we do not, we are dead. All right. Finally, we get a realistic description from Egypt. If you were an Egyptian firstborn and you had just heard that this guy Moses, who's been around for a year and has been making all sorts of predictions of doom and calamity, and they've all come true, and now he's predicting you'll be dead, don't you think you'd say, look, how about if we don't do this? Right? I mean, what kind of idiot goes through with this? So the firstborn, who are the ones that are the prime target, and remember in the previous plagues, we didn't get a target population other than Egypt, but here we actually have a specific group that are being targeted within Egypt, and that group is pushing back. They do not want to die. And so they say, look, enough is enough. Let the Israelites go. However, their own fathers answered them and said to them, even if all the Egyptians die, they will not go away from here. All right, so their families respond with nationalism, if you will, which is to say, we are not going to give in down to all of us, which is essentially saying we are prepared to let you die if it allows Egypt to retain her strength, her honor, that she not capitulate to this slave nation. And the firstborn don't take that well. What did they do? All the firstborn came together and went to Pharaoh. They cried out to Pharaoh and said to him, please have this people go away, for because of them evil will come. Again, obviously, Pharaoh, come on, how about if you make a deal so that this doesn't happen? He said to his servants, get going and beat those on the legs. So not only does he ignore their request, but he drives them out of the palace, whacking them for their insolence. So what did the firstborn do? Immediately when they had gone out, each and every one of them took his sword and killed his father. As it is stated in Psalms 136, to the one who smote Egypt through their firstborn. To the one who smote the firstborn of Egypt is not said, rather through their firstborn. So what is this close reading of Psalm 136 trying to teach us? Well, you would think that it would say God smote Egypt, God smote the firstborn of Egypt, because that's what he did. But Psalm 136 adds in that lovely little preposition, through or by means of, one little letter at the start of the Hebrew word, to tell us that God smote the Egyptians by means of the firstborn. Now, we could very superficially read that as being Egypt got hurt because the firstborn got hurt, but that's not what this midrash is doing. It's saying Egypt got hurt by the hands of the firstborn, meaning that there was this other element to our 10th plague where the Egyptians also suffered at the hands of the firstborn, because the firstborn were not happy about being sacrificed to continue Egyptian pride. And so they went out and caused this own catastrophe against the Egyptians, against their own families, in order to show their outrage and to try and convince them to allow the Israelites to go. Obviously, that didn't happen. So what happened next? After they had killed their fathers, the Holy One appeared and killed them. And now we get a perfect symmetry of justice. At the end, why were the firstborn killed? Because they murdered their own families. Now, you may find that a little far-fetched. You may find that as a bit of an apologetics, and that's okay. All right, like I said, there are many different explanations for this entire section, and we are supposed to feel uncomfortable with the passage as we try to wrestle with it, because we have been taught for the last 2,500 plus years that we should not rejoice at the murder of other people, that we should not think that the killing of mass population is good, that we should want justice to always be narrow and perfectly balanced. And that does make us very sensitive to these issues. But that also leads us to some of these insights. The idea being that, in fact, we can reconcile this slaughter of the firstborn with our desire for justice if we read from the rest of the Tanakh, in this case Psalm 136, that the firstborn actually deserved their punishment because the firstborn actually engaged in murder against their own family, which is considered to be one of the worst forms of murder that you can do. So when they were slain, it was appropriate justice for murderers, which they had become. Now, there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. If it had not been predicted that they would be killed, they wouldn't have acted in a way that eventually earned them the death sentence. But again, as we have seen throughout all of this, it is trying to remind us of our behaviors, that we should not sit callously by and say, oh, that group of people can be killed because it's for the higher good if there isn't a legitimate reason. The firstborn had a good cause. And when they went to the Egyptians, this was an opportunity for the Egyptians to recognize that allowing their own firstborn to die for the, quote, good of their nation was what they had already done when they had murdered the Israelite boys by throwing them in the river. That to say, we can kill a group of people because we'll be better off for it, even if they don't deserve it, is not a good look. And the Egyptians here had a chance to overcome that earlier crime that they had committed, at this point 80 years prior. They had a chance to show that they were different than that generation, but even for their own people, they were not willing to do so. They were willing to sacrifice their own people all this way rather than let the Israelites go. This is the unfortunate pain that so many people will inflict upon themselves and those around them. When they become caught in an idea that won't die, they are willing to let their own people suffer for it. The Egyptians had the opportunity all the way up until this very last moment to hear the cry of their own people, even if they wouldn't hear the cry of their supposed enemies, the Israelites. And yet they ignored it. And yet they allowed them to continue to die because in their mind, that was going to make them stronger. They would be able to weather this attack, that eventually Moses and God would apparently get bored and leave, and they would not have to capitulate. As we see, that's not what happened. It is heartbreaking and tragic, which is why our commentaries have gone so far to try and explain away some of the tragedy by saying that many of the firstborn were deserving, that the servants were deserving, but ultimately they didn't deserve to die. And that decision to let them die was not laid at the feet of God, who is the source of good. It was not laid at the feet of Moses. It was laid at the feet of the Egyptians themselves. They had multiple opportunities to change from their course. They were warned time and time again before death came to their doorstep. And in the end, They were willing to kill their own people as long as it meant that they could maintain their status and position. And once that became clear, then unfortunately, the only thing that was left was the violent reprisal of the 10th plague. And that worked for a time. Unfortunately, violence tends to lack a lasting impact on people who have this type of mentality. But at least it did allow Israel to leave and allow them to try and start a better life away from this Egyptian mentality. We will finish there. I will throw it open for any additional questions or comments. I'm not seeing any just yet. So I will bid everybody a fond farewell. We will continue our discussion of the Exodus next week. I hope everybody is enjoying their study of the book of Exodus. And do remember that as much as we try to delve deep onto any one passage in our Wednesday class, still make sure that you're reading the entirety of the parasha, looking at the other commentaries, allow your curiosity to be fed. There are so many great things to be learned that we just don't have time to do on any given Wednesday.